see if it's still, whoop, got it. Okay, it said recording in progress. I just hit. So I just wanted to see if it still was as compelling as I remembered. And it very, very much was. And so I immediately bought like every single book in the bookstore. And I went and introduced myself to the librarian there, who I ended up talking with several times on the phone. And I started digging into the research and knew there were so many stories. The question really wasn't for me, should I write a book about Ellis Island? It was, which story do I tell? And that was when, I was reading American Passage by this historian named Vincent Cannato. He's also a professor at UMass in Amherst. And he detailed some of the abuse happening there. And it struck me because it sounded so similar to some of the stories we read today that I thought, how can that be? And so I dug a little bit deeper and ended up in the New York Times archives and several other places, big tomes of immigrant interviews and so on. And that was my story. I knew that was the line I wanted to take. So
I guess when when you said, you tarried a bit in terms of figuring out your angle for how you're going to approach it. I guess my question really comes down to, usually for me, it's always sort of a protagonist that kind of, or at least I think it's a protagonist that's sort of the person that I want to write about or I want to put in the story. But in this case, it looks to me like you pick the John Lambert character or the, I guess, the Leger-Hilder gentleman that you had identified. So kind of tell us about that. You kind of went with the antagonist as the motivation, or at least the angle.
I actually didn't.
No?
I actually didn't. So, I had started that initial research and I have some German heritage in my background, but my mom's family is all Italian American. So you can see obviously where I have these two different, cultural groups coming into the US immediately. So I kind of knew I wanted to go down that path, especially because in 1902, German Americans were the largest and German immigrants were still the largest percentage of cultural groups that had settled in the US at that time. And that was actually true until, I want to say it's mid 20th century, believe it or not. And you just don't see stories about them very often. And I thought, again, how is this? And as I dug in, I learned some about how after World War II, we ended up kind of erasing the German American heritage from our history in lots of ways. And so I wanted to dig into that. And then, once I had decided on the two protagonists, I started to, I figured out what I wanted their backstories to look like, who they were as people before the book opened. And then I realized, like all good books, you need an antagonist. And that's when I really started to dig in looking for that angle. And then, so Leger-Hilder, John Lambert, actually was not the beginning. He kind of came in when I had, I think, about 100 pages written and realized, okay, this is all nice and dandy, but what's the crux of my story? And so that's how I ended up with him.
So which came first, Alma or Francesca, in terms of your characters? And did you pick one or the other first, or did you sort of have them both and you envision them at the same time?
I mostly envisioned them at the same time, but I will say that probably Alma a bit more before Francesca, only because she's a language lover. And I used to teach high school French and Spanish. So there's this, the book was called The Language of Dreams while it was out on submission. And in fact, my publisher changed the title to The Next Ship Home, which I like. I mean, I can see the emotional stakes in the title, but The Language of Dreams to me was just so metaphorical. And I liked that, one was striving to fit in and the other one was striving to find her place in this world she had never anticipated. So yeah, I would say probably Alma a bit more than Francesca, but just by a hair, not a lot. They were really kind of simultaneous. I like to show two perspectives in a book pretty often, because I think there's no such thing as one truth. And so to have someone who worked at Ellis Island versus someone who was coming through would give a really interesting picture of, from different angles, of what was happening there.
So I'm going to hold on the rest of mine and let folks jump in. It looks like Carol, you've sent me a note. Carol Cohen, who's from Boston area.
All right. Near me.
I'll let her go first. Anybody else has a question? You guys know how to raise your hand and let me know.
So I'll go. I'm actually from New York originally, but I do live south of Boston. I might not be that far from you. And I actually did write a play about Ellis Island that was published, and I would love to send it to you.
I would love to read it.
So you'll have another thing for your collection. So I think you might have just answered this sort of, but I always like to ask authors that I meet, why first person, why third person instead of first? Do you usually write in third? I can understand with the two perspectives that might be your answer, but is it?
I love this question because there is a reason for it, at least for me as a writer. I pick whatever perspective serves the story best. So for example, in this case, third person worked best because you have a woman who doesn't speak great English. And so to write in first person would be extremely grating and clunky to read after a while. So I felt third person was really kind of the only way to go with this book. My book coming out in March that is Strangers in the Night, and it's a novel of Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner. I started in third person thinking, I can't be in Frank Sinatra's head. Who can be in Frank Sinatra's head? But I couldn't get close enough to the characters. So after writing several chapters, I actually switched to first. And all of a sudden I could hear them both. I could hear Ava and I could hear Frank in my head. So I think, it really just depends on the story. Some need third, and this, in the next ship home, it's a little bit of a distant third. It's not terribly distant, but it's more so than some other third person books I've written, which are much closer. So, it all really just kind of depends on what the story needs.
Well, thank you. That's the best way I think I've ever heard it described. I couldn't get close enough to the character. That's like a really fabulous answer. You should keep that in case anybody else asks you, because that was a great way to put it. Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
I was going to say, interestingly, about first person versus third person, I find, just as an aside, Carol, if I write in first person, I put entirely too much expository language, and then you're losing some of the action in that case. That's just my bad habits, I suppose. A lot of authors can do it and do it beautifully. I just find that I'm telling everybody a story as opposed to showing them what's happening. So that's just my reason why I always write in third person, because I can't figure out how to do it without.
It's interesting, Sharon, because I'm the opposite. I find that with first person, I'm right in the middle of the action all the time. Huh. And I'm sort of seeing through their lens, but third person, I tend to have to watch my exposition a bit, Yeah. So that's why we're all different, right?
Yeah, we're all different. I just have a hard time with it. I've yet to do one in first person, as you guys know, but I've tried. It's not very easy for me anyway.
I think it's also what we prefer, how we prefer to read sometime.
Mm-hmm.
Like I prefer to read in the third person, so maybe that's why I would prefer to write in the third person. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think until your book really demands that you write in first person, and I'm saying this as if it has its own mind, and it absolutely does. Sometimes the characters do things you don't expect, and the story takes a turn that you don't expect. It actually happened with The Next Ship Home. I had several things happen that I had not planned on, and I had to cut the whole last third of the book and rewrite it. And that was, let me tell you, that was painful. But you know what? You have to do what it calls for, and just know that that's part of the process. It's about learning what the story is, and it almost feels like a living, breathing thing sometimes. So if it wants first, it's going to tell you. I don't care if you want third. I need to be told in first person, or whatever, vice versa. So
good advice. Jean, you're up. Jean Dagna.
Hi, Heather. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. you said you came across a lot of different stories when you researched and spent time at Ellis Island. What were some of the other stories that you came across that you opted not to use?
Oh
What
God,
you were
there's so
still
many.
intrigued with in the beginning, you know?
Yeah. Okay. Well, there was a lot about sexual harassment. There was a lot about different kinds of work where people were funneled into these different professions, sort of without knowing, you know, they would get employment papers and show up, and then it would turn out to be not at all what they expected. There was a lot that was really beautiful and touching, but doesn't make for great fiction.
Yeah.
So I did a lot of crying reading those immigrant interviews because they were really beautiful and touching, but they don't make a good story. So there was a lot of that happened too. A couple of things that I ended up not putting in the book that were not in the interviews, but were fascinating during that time period was, one, because of the major gossip about the corruption at Ellis Island, it reached Washington. And Theodore Roosevelt, who was fairly new at that time when my book opened in 1902, you know, he stepped in after an anarchist assassinated McKinley. So he'd heard all these horrible rumors and finally scheduled a visit out to Ellis Island himself. And I actually wrote this entire scene, but I couldn't make it work because it was 1903 and this whole big 40 people being fired and, you know, brought before the grand jury was 1902. So I had to cut it. But Roosevelt, he went out and visited, and it was a horrific storm happening. So where the East River meets the Hudson is already a bit turbulent. It took him 2.5 hours to get from shore to Ellis Island because they had to keep turning around. They almost capsized. And they finally got out there. Of course, the big fancy lunch they had prepared, which they don't normally serve to immigrants, had all gotten cold. And but he did make it, and he walked through, and then immediately on his return demanded a formal inspection because he saw just enough. Even though they were all on their best behavior, he saw just enough that he demanded another inspection. So he was really one of the first presidents that created widespread immigration reform for the better.
Wow.
Mostly. So I ended up having to cut that. The other thing I cut was also 1903, a ferry called the General Slocum had been carrying 1,000 German-American immigrants out to a church picnic to one of the little islands there in the bay. And it sunk, it caught fire and sunk, and over 1,000 women and children died. And it was considered the biggest tragedy in New York City history until 9/11. And no one's heard of it. And I thought, how is that possible? We've heard of the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire, which didn't lose anywhere near the number of people, but we've never heard of the General Slocum sinking. And so I had written a whole thing on that too. And I ended up having to cut. I just couldn't jam it all in. There was just so many interesting facts and just some great information. But you know, that's not what the story was about. So I ended up having to cut that. But that tragedy did secure the exodus of German Americans from Lower Manhattan.
Well, it's interesting you say that because, like Carol, I grew up in New York. I grew up on Long Island, and I've never heard the story about the sinking of that ferry. So that's fascinating. But the Triangle Shirtwaist was something that came up all the time.
All the time. There's a lot of books. It's in fiction. It pops up in fiction all the time. Even Sue Meisner, I don't know if you've read her book, Fall of Marigolds. It's Ellis Island. Yeah, and that's got a whole thing on the factory fire. And she, you know, she was surprised when she and I talked about this. She said, "What? I didn't come across that." Well, there's a whole book about it at the Tenement Museum, and that's how I found it.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, we had, I think Susan Meisner last year, last June, I think it was, with one of her book about the earthquake. She was on with us. So
she's lovely. Yeah.
Lovely. Yes. Miriam, you're up next.
Hi, Heather. I want to tell you I really liked your book, and there's a nice review for you up on Goodreads.
Oh, thank you.
I do a lot of reviewing, so I'll just steal that from Sharon. I do a lot of reviewing, and I really just love the book. I'm a historian and I'm a librarian, and I grew up like way out on Long Island in a spot you've never heard of. But anyway, I thought it was really interesting that your German immigrant, Alma, seemed to be very close to, I've immigrated recently, and most of the Germans who came to New York came a lot earlier. So I found that juxtaposition of the time frame very interesting, that they were then encountering these Southern Europeans. So I'm wondering if there was a reason why you did the Germans as opposed to like, oh, I don't know.
The Irish.
Well, yeah, the Irish. I would have expected the Irish and the Italians to be living closer to one another and not the Germans, because the Germans should have already been out of Ellis, the Lower East Side.
They weren't. This is
And they
where
weren't.
the General Slocum actually created this mass exodus from that area. They lost so many people. I think they had already started to move out. So they were becoming, they were shrinking at this point for sure. But, so you probably know this as a historian, but 18 major revolutions happening in Europe. So, and especially in Germany and France, and then, anarchism and wanting to no longer have a king, et cetera, democracy making its way. And this is what caused so many to come to the US. And so I had my German-American family were fairly recently immigrated, but within a few decades, like I mentioned that, Ledgerhelder comes over as a very young child, so that there's still links to the past there, but not terribly, not the terribly distant past. And that was because I wanted to show that there's this echelon of immigrants, like in hierarchy, who's at the bottom and who's at the top, who's in the middle, that very much existed then and frankly still exists today. It's just different ethnic groups, Indian Americans, Chinese Americans, Hispanics. There's a hierarchy, whether we want to admit it or not, and it's very much there. So yeah, I wanted to show a bit of that, and that's why I still had these links to the past. But there were German Americans coming through, or Germans, I shouldn't say German Americans, Germans coming through Ellis Island even in 1902. In fact, I got a coffee mug from the gift shop there that has a list of the number of immigrants from different countries on it, which was very cool. And there were still quite a few Germans coming through as late as 1907. So so that's
interesting. I also liked how you integrated history and all of those nitty-gritty facts and figures so smoothly into your narrative, like the scenes, the elements that you need to have in the immigration record. And I just found that very slick. So slick is in positive sense. I really liked the fact that you just kind of threw all that stuff in and didn't really fudge it.
There's art to giving the information without dumping it. I feel like you're reading the story and you're learning about the history of Prussia or whatever it is. I think teaching high school kids for a decade probably helped me with that, to be on interest level. And so you learn to dance on your head a little bit, I think. And so I try to do that in my fiction. So it's really nice of you to say that. Thank you.
Thanks.
That is definitely a goal.
Laura? Laura?
Yeah, I'm unmuting.
Okay, thanks.
So to kind of piggyback on Miriam, why did you choose Italian and German to make them friends? Why those two nationalities?
Well, the Italians were the largest ethnic group coming through, if you want to call it ethnic group, cultural group, European country. They were the largest coming through at that time in 1902. So that made sense. But also my mother's family is Italian. They're American, but they can't, and they didn't come through Ellis Island. None of my family members came through Ellis Island. We were here long before Ellis Island. In fact, my dad's family was in the early 1600s. So I should probably look up and see if I'm eligible for Daughters of the American Revolution. But yeah, so I chose connected to somewhat. As I mentioned, I have a lot of German heritage as well. So.
Other questions we have any? Miriam again? Did I lose you, Miriam? Miriam, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm always happy to ask.
Oh, I'm
another
sorry. I
question.
thought I saw your hand.
Um,
though. I'm
So I knew your name was familiar when I started reading. Yeah.
Oh. there we go.
Oh, you want me to yak or do you want to get somebody else?
Oh,
Sharon.
well, it doesn't matter. Carol's got her hand up as well. So if you've got I mean, I saw your hand up. I don't know if my machine is, what's going on? I'm having an internet problem here all of a sudden. I may have to turn my video off, just so that
Oh,
I don't lose you guys. Maybe that's better. But go ahead, Mary, you got a
No
question? And
problem.
then Carol, you're next. And anybody else, just please jump in because I have other questions as well.
Oh.
yeah.
I see Ribbons of Scarlet.
Yeah, so yeah, I loved this one too. I gotta
Oh,
say,
thank you.
I loved Ribbons of Scarlet, and I was looking to see who you did, which was Condorcet, who's just wonderful. So I noticed that he's the revolutionary, and then you pick up anarchist. Is this a trend of yours that you really like this? These kind of the sidelight of the political issues that you want to bring into your work, or was
That's an
this just
excellent
kind of a
question.
one-off?
Okay, so I actually did not write Condorcet. That
Oh,
was
wait a minute, did I get the
Steph
wrong
who was
person?
she was one of the leaders of the first women's march on Versailles.
Sorry.
But yes, no, do I look for revolution? Not necessarily, but I think I am interested in the common person. And that's hard to sell in publishing, by the way. They really want you to write about well-known figures. I mean, I started with Josephine Bonaparte, and obviously you have the French Revolution there. And then I moved to Camille Claudel and Rodin, because I love art, but she was also a bit of a different road to go down in terms of writing books. So I've had to kind of fight my way in publishing with these slightly less well-known topics, but I think that there's a lot of value in writing those stories, and they make me happy to dig into these pieces. So do I look for conflict? Well, yeah, I mean, that makes for an interesting story, right? But the anarchism actually is what in this time period is one of the things that definitely drew me to writing The Next Ship Home. Just because when I learned about it, I realized how different it is from what our vision of it is today, which is somebody wearing a black jumpsuit and mask and running around screaming and spray painting stuff with no rhyme or reason. And you're just like, what? That is the dumbest thing. Who are these people? That's not at all what it really was or where it came from. And so that's the kind of stuff that's fun to debunk, to find the roots for. But I definitely look for conflict. I mean, I have a book set in World War I. I have a book right between the wars as well. And I'm currently working on a book set in 1920s London, and it's about an all-female shoplifting ring that was real.
Pretty.
And so once again, you got that gritty sort of offbeat, and this is so super fun to write. So I can't wait to share that.
All right, I'm going to go with
So
Beth.
Carol and Beth.
Beth, really quick, since you haven't asked a question yet, and then I'll hit Carol and Laura. Beth?
Okay,
And
Heather,
Jane.
I really liked the inclusion of the newspaper clips. And I wondered, did you pick the clip and then write something, or did you write something and find a clip to go with?
Great question. I actually found the clips first. I have this enormous document that it weighed down my computer hard drive, where I found about 30 articles, and I copied and pasted them all in this huge. I have a membership to New York Times, so I didn't feel bad about that. But I just way down my computer and I ended up having to go through and delete a bunch, but I found and I rewrote them so that they were fictional. And so that they weren't, if you're reading articles from back then, there's right in the newspaper. So I had to kind of massage the language quite a bit to make it fiction worthy. But yeah, I mean, you could find, if you wanted to find headlines very similar to the ones that I wrote, you could find them for sure.
Thanks.
So it looks like Jane, actually, have you been waving?
Jane, yes. Okay, let me unmute myself. Yes, hi. So I don't have a really question about this particular book, just about how you write. Do you, once you start a book, well, first, do you write one book at a time, or do you ever have two books going on at the same time?
I often have two books going on at the same time because if you look at my website, I write solo novels, but I also write with a partner friend, and her name is Hazel Gaynor, and she's an English author. Okay. Our books tend to be a little bit more romantic, but they, our aim is to make them a little bit more escapist than our individual titles. So we're often switching off. In fact, we're working on a book called Christmas with the Queen right now, which is the 5 Christmases of Queen Elizabeth from 52 to 57. We've got fictional characters mixed in there, but so I switch off, and I find it actually really refreshing. It helps keep me inspired to work on one or the other. While one is resting, sometimes working on the other one unlocks a problem I'm having in the other manuscript, which is really cool. It's amazing how our subconscious works that way. So,
well, it's interesting. It's the way you speak. You seem to be like a fast-paced person, and I think that you can multitask. So, and then the other thing is, do you write something every day, or do you take days off and just, so let me think
my
about.
My brain demands days off. If I could write every day, I probably would, but I just don't work that way. In fact, I have a really gnarly deadline. November 1st, I have to turn in this book about the shoplifting ring, and it's been the roughest deadline for a lot of personal reasons, but I had to drag myself through my word count the last week and a half because my brain just needed time to think. I'm in the middle of the book and I have to puzzle out all these pieces and figure out how they're going to come together. I love all the setup. The first part of the book is easy. The last part of the book is easy. That middle is hard. And so I'm right in the middle. I'm trying to, I need to think about it. But meanwhile, it's like the clock is ticking and I need to get the words down. So, but you know what? The book is going to take what it takes. So I have been pacing. My husband's like, oh my God.
Okay, well, thank you.
All right, Carol, well, I've got Susan, Laura, and Carol, and so
it's
Susan
okay. I don't mind chatting more. It's fine. So there's no rush.
Carol, then Laura, then Susan, and then Evelyn asked a question in the chat. So let's Carol, can you go up? You're off mute.
Yes, before I asked a question before, I should have said, thank you very much for being here and that I love the book. So my question is, why Frank Sinatra?
Oh.
You don't have to answer it now. You could wait till the end after we're finished talking about this book. But I'm sitting here thinking about my mom when she was 17, standing on the seats in the Paramount Theater, screaming for Frank. So I just was wondering why Frank Sinatra?
Well, I was actually approached by my publisher, believe it or not. Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner do not seem like a logical follow-up to The Next Ship Home, and they're not really. And the reason is they asked me to write this a few years ago, and I had a family emergency during the pandemic with one of my kids, so it pushed everything back, but it's finally coming out in March, and it feels like a really illogical thing to come out next. But I was not going to say no to writing a book about these two. I mean, I grew up listening to Frank with my grandparents, and let me tell you, they both had ridiculously scandalous lives. It's like watching a train wreck in motion. So I was riveted. So it was fun to write the book, but it's definitely not something that I looked at all the topics and said, I'm going to write about that. In fact, I'm a little scared of the Sinatras because the daughters are still alive. And
Well, I
But I
will,
did so much research, I can't even tell you.
so what we can do, we can sort of look at that as something we could, entertain next year, once it comes out. So, Laura quickly, and then Susan.
Sure.
Okay, the Lancaster, Mrs. Lancaster. Could you
Yes.
tell me your thought process? Boy, did you throw in a winger at the end.
Okay, I love that you said that because I did not plan on that. I was working on a draft. I'd written a first draft, even a second draft, and I was in revisions and I just thought, I just hate this character. She needs more dimension. She just is this sort of whiny rich woman who's mean to everybody, and I can't deal with it. I need some nuance. And I just kept thinking about it and I couldn't figure out what it was. And I started writing that scene where she was about to fire Francesca. And it literally, it wasn't a conscious thought. It flowed from my fingers into the computer. And it was, she gave her this ring and said, this is what happened to me. This is the best way. And I just went, oh
Wow,
my God,
wow.
that's it. Isn't that funny? And I actually just got goosebumps now. It's one of those things where fiction is magical sometimes. And that was one of those moments. And then I had to go back and actually plant the seeds for this. So I had not written that all the way through the book. I had to go back and add, the portrait in the drawing room and all that stuff. I didn't have any of that figured out ahead of time.
That was
So-
the fabulous.
Yeah, I think that-
suspenseful.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think that's what happens a lot of times when we write, is that, characters present themselves, reveal themselves to you over time, and it takes a bit. And I think
It does, yeah.
that's exactly what, happens. And a lot of that happens once you get to know those primary characters better. Those secondary characters will reveal themselves too over time. Susan, you're up, or Suzanne, I'm sorry. Suzanne, you're up.
Suzanne, yeah, hey, thanks. Well, thanks for being here, Heather. I love the book.
Thank you.
Did you think about, or is there still the possibility for any kind of sequel? Because when I got to the end, I was just like, well, thank goodness there was an epilogue, but have you thought about that? Or
I've been asked this a lot, actually, which has surprised me because it did not occur to me to write a sequel, to be honest.
okay,
I'm not sure what the story would be. I mean, it would be, and then they lived happily ever after. I would have to create all this drama. I think that I love that people want more of them. And that was kind of my goal, is to throw Francesca a bone. She'd been through so much. And I thought, she gets nothing, this poor girl, and has to start over again. So at the very least, I'm going to give her the man.
yeah, that's awesome.
But they both had to sacrifice too. It wasn't just, happily ever after. So yeah, I haven't, when I think about writing a full book, it would require, it's not the work, it would just be, I'd have to create a lot of drama that I'm not sure would further the story that well. But you know what? Who knows? Maybe I'll write a novella or a short story or something, because I've had a lot of people say, I want to see them together in Chicago. So
Yeah, exactly. I mean, think about, for instance, Downton Abbey, where it just keeps happening in different eras and different amounts of drama. So,
and I've seen them all. I've seen all those.
Me too. Me too. All right, thanks.
Sure.
Okay, and then I saw that Evelyn had asked a question in the chat about, had you ever visited the hospital on the island? I'm trying to,
Right. Okay. So I haven't been inside of it. I signed up for the hard hat tour that you can take through. And I should know better, but I made the mistake of going and booking the tickets in August. And if you've been to New York City in August and July, so you're shaking your head. Yes, you know what I'm talking about. It's so full of tourists. It's hectic. It's chaotic. I know better. I love to go there in off season, or just not July and August. And I got there a little and waited in line forever. And didn't get on the ferry in time and ended up missing my ticket time. So I ended up eating the cost of the tickets and didn't make it out there. But I did have, I'd already written most of the book at that point, but I thought, you know what, that's the one spot I haven't gone to. I would like to just go through, I've seen tons of pictures. It actually opened the year that this book takes place. I know Susan Meisner's book is set primarily there and in the city. But yeah, so I missed it. Maybe one of these days.
So I have a question for you.
Sure.
A couple of them, but one was, how long did it take you? So how much research, how long did you do the research on? And then how long do you think it took to do the original writing? And then of course there's all the edits, which is usually twice as long as it took you to write it. So, but there's that. So how long did it take you?
It's funny. I'm actually the opposite. This is a great question because I'm actually the opposite. I'm a very deliberate drafter. So it takes me, even though I write like a builder, I sort of put a foundation and then put walls up and a roof and so on. But I'm a slow drafter. So it'll take me 9 or 10 months to draft a book. And then I can usually I do about between 8 and 10 drafts. And I can usually be done with that in another half a year or so. But this book took 3 years, took a little over 3 years. And I have to say, did it really? It was in large part because I was working on a lot of collaborations. I wrote Ribbons of Scarlet, that French Revolution book, with several other authors. I wrote a couple of books with Hazel Gaynor. So I think if you compared all the hours worked, it's probably average out to what all my books take, which is about 2 years. And I always front load the research. I'll research for a few, like 2 to 3 months, and make a historical outline and start working on character ideas. And then I kind of research a little dribs and drabs as I go, as stuff comes up in the story that I need to look up. You could research forever and never write. So I usually put a timeline, like a end point. No matter what happens at this day, I'm going to stop and I'm going to start writing. So.
Interesting. I also noticed you said that you stayed really true to your dates. You don't necessarily move things around in order to help with pacing. You do?
I try not to. Yeah, I try to stay as close as possible just because people want to learn about history through fiction. I think it's more fun. And so I really try not to mislead people into thinking that something is totally other than it was. I mean, obviously I'm going to have a lot of my own interpretation. That's unavoidable, but yeah, I mean, I try really hard to stay to the record. Now, something like The Next Ship Home was fairly, I shouldn't say easy because there's really nothing easy about it, except I had fictional characters. So there's a lot of leeway, mostly fictional characters, like the Frank Sinatra book. Holy cow. Every inch of that man's life has been documented. Ava Gardner too, although not quite as much. But so I because I'm basically putting words in the mouths of extremely famous people, and that was a challenge in and of itself too. But totally different kind of exercise to The Next Ship Home.
That's brave. I think that's why I always get concerned.
scared.
Are there
Scared.
descendants I need to be worried about, even if they're like 6 generations away? I still worry about misrepresented. And interestingly enough, I wrote the book that I wrote that was released last year. I actually know some of the great children of one of our characters, and one of them said that she was quite upset with how I depicted not even her descendant, but someone else in the book, because she had a grandparent name by it. And I was like, oh my gosh, y'all just need to stop, right?
Yeah, it's inevitable.
Right.
Luckily, we're covered under the fiction umbrella. It's not like I'm saying this happened in a factual record. I'm not writing nonfiction.
Right. But I know how people can definitely be, they get very upset about this stuff. All right. Any other questions from anybody before I ask my final one? All right, where's Teresa? She's always got a question. Or Sarah, you always have a question. Come on. I know Janet's not on tonight. Beth, yes, ma'am. Beth, you have a question? No, you already had one. Nobody? You guys are really being quiet tonight.
I think I'm scary.
I was gonna say. No, you're not scary at all. It was a great book. I mean, I really enjoy it. Miriam's got a question. She got her hand up. I see it. Yes.
All right, I'll ask another question. So what are you reading? What should we read? What are you reading?
Yes, okay. I'm pulling up my phone here because I do read in print, but I read a ton of audio. I listen to a lot of audiobooks because I can multitask as a mother driving to baseball and volleyball and everything else. So I just finished, where is it here? Counterfeit. And it is by Kristen Chen. And I don't know if you've seen it advertised anywhere. It has a fantastic cover. I love the cover of this book. And it's about a housewife that gets embroiled in a counterfeit handbag scheme. And she's Chinese American, and she needs the money, and she's got issues with her marriage anyway. She gets sucked into this counterfeit handbag scheme, and I found that fascinating, and it was a very fast, fun read. So I finished that, and I'm currently reading. Do you know Sarah Penner? She wrote The Lost Apothecary. Yeah, I'm seeing some thumbs up. Yeah, so her new book is a Victorian era whodunit. So it's literally a murder mystery, and it is called The London Seance Society, I believe. And I'm actually in the middle of reading that for an endorsement. You know how there's quotes on the back of the book, and I'm enjoying that too. It's very atmospheric. I love a good Gothic. So,
what was the name of it again?
So I'm working
Heather?
on this. The London Seance Society.
Okay.
That's by Sarah Penner, and then Counterfeit by Kristen Chen.
Thank you.
So I'm usually reading something contemporary and something historical. And I love book club, just sort of generic book club fiction. All kinds of stuff, magical realism.
Perfect.
You say that you listen to audiobooks. So how do you like the reader for your audiobook, for your book?
I liked this one. I was nervous because I'm picky about the narrators. Now that I've listened to so many, you can have a great book that is absolutely murdered by a bad narrator. And sometimes a book I really want to read, if the narrator is terrible, I'll stop it and have to go buy it in paperback or go to the library or whatever. But I was pleased that she was quite good, I thought. So that was a huge relief.
So I have to say is that I have listened and have read the book, and I enjoyed both because I read it on the Kindle, and I had the audio version with it, and I multitask as well. So you can walk and do other stuff. And I enjoyed the audiobook part of it as well. It just made it very real. I think that it made especially the way it made the characters much more real. But then I read a little bit as well. So I multitask reading and listening your book.
I do a lot of that myself. Yeah, I think a great audio narrator can really elevate a book. You know, it's not really a play or a movie, obviously, but it's something that's higher than a book in some ways. In other ways, not, but in some ways that they're fun to listen to when you get a good one, for sure.
Yeah.
Laura, you have a question?
Yeah. Did Fritz have any faults?
Did he have any faults? I thought he had a bit of what's the word I'm trying to say here? He had a temper problem a little bit. He got angry. He was quick to anger here and there. But I wouldn't say terribly so. Maybe a bit of a workaholic. You know, he was super driven and worked really, really hard and put everything else aside to, at his own expense in some ways. So you were looking for faults in Fritz, weren't you?
I was. He was too perfect.
He was pretty great. He was pretty great. But, we had faults in everybody else. So I had to make his kind of minor.
Although I think Fritz was blind a bit to his own passions.
He was.
He was blind to his friends. He was too trusting. And he was sort of caught in the middle of, between being a boss and of course, being one of the guys. And so I think he was blind to that position he was in and sort of naive. So if that's a fault, I think that's certainly something he learned in this story.
I agree. And his dedication to the anarchist thing was, I think, a bit of a fault too. He was basically being warned off of it for a million reasons, and he put his family at risk and himself at risk.
Indeed.
That's true.
Debbie, question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, perfect. First, Heather, thank you for being with us. I always enjoy when the authors join us. I really did enjoy your book, but I did have a question,
Sure.
not necessarily about the book. You had mentioned that you were a teacher for about 10 years. Thank you for that. Are you still teaching now? And were you writing when you were a teacher?
So I'm not a high school teacher anymore. I resigned when my daughter was 1 and I got pregnant with my second. And it was honestly just very point blank going to cost me more money to put my kids in daycare and put me in debt than it would be to actually be home with my kids and not pay for daycare. And that was a very easy choice for me. I know for others, everyone's choice is different and that's fine. But for me, I wanted to be home with them. And so I resigned, and it was very hard because I love high school kids. I know that makes me strange, but I do. And I really loved my job. I was an advisor and a coach and a million different things for the school. I took big field trips with the students, took them to France. But I don't teach high school anymore. I have been in various forms of teaching since then. I've taught, I'm an adjunct for the MFA in writing program at Drexel University right now. I've taught at a community college. I've done adult ed. I do tons of writing conference sessions. I've led writing retreats domestically and internationally. So I haven't really given up teaching. It just looks a bit different. But my main job is writing. I also am a freelance editor, so I work on a lot of people's books with them, and there's a lot of teaching in that as well. So, and I did not write while I was a high school teacher, no. And in fact, the idea for my first book came to me before I had resigned, though. It was that last semester, and I was finishing my master's degree. I had a 1-year-old. I was part-time. I was just like, part-time in teaching is not really a thing. So I kept having a dream about Josephine Bonaparte, who I knew very little about. It was really strange. I had just taken students to France and they'd come home, and I kept seeing Versailles and Josephine walking through Versailles. Well, that's not where she lived, but I kept seeing her there in my head. And I finally went and checked out a biography about her, and then said to my husband halfway through reading that biography, I think I have to write a book about this woman. He was kind of like, what? Okay, whatever, good luck, And I really fell in love with writing at that point. But most of that happened outside of after I had resigned.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you. And let me try to put my video back on. My internet for some reason never does this, but it is freaking out tonight and I'm having some difficulties. So I apologize. I have one last question and then we'll let you go. And that is, was there a particular message that you wanted to leave the reader with this book?
Yes, I think my message, it's not so dissimilar from all of my books really, which is that every story has more than one side, and that I think you can justify any kind of behavior, and you can justify any sort of emotion or feelings about something or opinions based on your own life experience and based on how you are treated and received in the world and how you internalize that. And I think that in this case, I wanted people to see that immigration is not so cut and dry. It's not who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. I mean, can we let everybody in? Of course we can't let everybody in. Who do we keep out? How do you decide? How does that, I hope, isn't one that people feel like I'm telling you the answer. I want to ask questions, and I want the reader to think about and to see that these are multifaceted, difficult questions that aren't necessarily black and white. I'm big on the whole life isn't so black and white most of the time kind of thing in my stories. And just, me as a person, I try to be open-minded, and I wanted to show that in the story. I wanted people to walk away feeling like, maybe it wasn't what I thought it was. Or maybe I should look into them. Then I feel like I've done my job. That mixed with, I hope people want to go look up more information.
Well, thank you for that. And having just, the company before, my company before I sold it in 2017, we processed about 90% of this country's applications for immigration, either through USCIS or the State Department or the background investigations at the FBI, you name it. And so having worked in immigration for 10 years, I found the story fascinating. And as you said in your comments, it's not that all much different then as it is now in terms of the tough decisions that have to be made, not necessarily,
The process.
I can assure you there are none of what's went on at Ellis Island is going on at the borders, at least from USCIS and those folks. But it's a tough thing, and it's just an interesting perspective, and I really appreciated the story from
Well,
my
it's
perspective.
nice to have someone too who knows the modern aspects of this, reading and thinking about it. Because
Yeah, it's a tough business, and honestly, I'm glad I sold it, and I'm doing this. I'm writing now, so it's
good for you.
much more fun.
I would also, I imagine that's true. I wouldn't want to have been in your shoes. It's a very, very hard thing to do.
Yeah.
So,
all right. So, Heather, thank you so very much for joining us, and all of you all for joining in today. I mean, I thought I got a lot of notes from folks saying that they weren't going to be able to make it because they were on vacation. And so I'm just happy we have the crowd we do. You guys are always fabulous. And we always love when we have the author.
no, it's wonderful. I love chatting with you.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank you very
Have
much.
a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy
Thank
reading.
you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. We loved it. All right, ladies, and I'm gonna make this short because I don't know how long my phone's gonna hold up or my computer's gonna hold up. It's interesting. I don't know what ever happens, but this is the first time I've had internet problems here at the house. Next month's book is the book club. We're gonna do it on the 22nd of September. I would have done it on the 29th, but I have an engagement that evening and cannot. So it's still the fourth Thursday in the month. And we'll be reading Booth by Karen Joy Fowler. Has anyone read that one yet?
Booth by Karen Joy Fowler.
Yes. Did I cut out, Avery?
Yeah.
Sorry, I apologize. Yes, it's Booth by Karen Joy Fowler. So I'm turning my video off. A very interesting book. It's a little long, but I really enjoyed it. So I hope you guys do as well.
Okay.
You know what the book is after. Yes, it is John. It is a story of the growing up of John Wilkes Booth.
Wow.
So it's quite interesting. And I think you guys are gonna like it.
Great.
Fiction or non?
It is always fiction.
Okay.
Historical fiction. It's fiction, yes. And it's interesting. I'm trying to find some things that I think are a little different. And this one, I just was fascinated by it because it's a part of the story we don't really get to know, right? I mean, Booth was always just this wicked guy who killed the president, but in terms of sort of how he grew up and the why behind who he became is what I found interesting. And it's also the time period, where it's told from his sister's perspective, which I think is interesting as well. And her struggles in this very, very dysfunctional family. So I think you'll enjoy it. Avery will have the book club materials out to you probably by Tuesday, which is the day after Labor Day, because I have not yet reviewed them. Sorry, I've been bad. But I've been busy. I've been working on book number 3, and I've got a contract for Veil of Doubt. So, and it looks like it's going to be published, my second book, next August. So a year from now. That's how long it takes.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, very nice.
Yeah,
So I
congratulations.
already downloaded it.
Ah,
Good luck with that.
Sharon, you said the 22nd of
The
September?
22nd, Miriam, yes. 22nd.
Perfect. Okay.
Thursday, the 22nd at 7. I don't have Karen Joy Fowler aligned yet to join us. I will reach out and try to see if I can do that. Usually I do it in advance, but I got behind this summer. So it may just be us. We'll see. We'll find out. All right. All right,
Okay.
guys,
Thanks, Sharon.
I'm sorry I can't see you. You guys can't see me. It's really bad. My internet's really out. So I will see you guys next month and enjoy your Labor Day
Thank you,
weekend.
Sharon.
All right.
Everybody
Sharon.
have a great
Bye.
Labor Day
Thank
weekend.
you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.